The emergency meeting at Halston Dynamics was supposed to be a final, straightforward prep session before the global rollout of their cutting-edge energy system. Instead, the entire building plunged into chaos the moment the main generator failed without warning, leaving everyone in sudden darkness. Tension flared, panic set in. Senior engineers scrambled like ants from a kicked mound, flipping through manuals and talking over one another with no clear solution in sight. No one wanted to be the first to admit that they might not have the answer. In the back of the room, standing silently in a corner with his arms crossed, was Nick Ramsey, a 38-year-old maintenance contractor. Quiet and observant, he watched the scene unfold without saying a word. Nick had seen far worse under far worse conditions. This was just a dark room and a bunch of scared white-collar folks. From across the room, Vivian Halston, CEO and public face of the company, slowly turned toward him. At 32 years old, Vivian was both admired and feared, strikingly attractive, ruthlessly ambitious, and well known in the business world for her sharp tongue and colder heart. She wore her power like armor, each word calculated, each glance deliberate. With a smirk that teetered between challenge and mockery, she addressed Nick directly. "If you can get that generator running by 2 a.m., she said loud enough for the room to hear, "I'll kiss you in front of everyone right here. Deal?" Her tone was playful, but her eyes were sharp. She wasn't joking. And she wasn't being kind. Vivian had inherited more than just her father's billion-dollar energy empire. She had inherited his obsession with perfection, his strategic mind, and his emotional detachment. At 21, she graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, and by 27, she had transformed 3 floundering tech subsidiaries into profitable branches before taking over Halston Dynamics. By 31, she'd grown the company's valuation to over $15 billion. The media had dubbed her the Ice Duchess of Green Tech. Always dressed in pristine suits tailored to her lean frame, Vivian wore her silver blonde hair in a tight chignon that never loosened, even in a crisis. Her expressions were unreadable, blank, elegant, distant. But behind her polished exterior lived a fracture that never quite healed. At 14, Vivian had discovered her mother's body in the guesthouse bathtub, an overdose, intentional. A brief note had been left behind, scrawled on a linen card, "Love is weakness." That sentence became Vivian's doctrine. She never let anyone get close enough to hurt her again. Love was messy. Vulnerability was foolish. Marriage was business, and sex was leverage. And blue-collar men like Nick Ramsey? They barely registered in her world. They existed, yes, but in the background like fixtures. Nick's world, by contrast, revolved around a single person, his 8-year-old daughter, Maya. He used to be Major Nicholas Ramsey, head of engineering logistics for the U.S. Army. He had designed and implemented power systems for military bases in hostile zones. No small task. A decorated soldier. A respected leader. He had a future carved out in steel and stars. But when his wife Lauren walked out, leaving nothing behind but a crumpled note that read, "I'm drowning and I can't breathe here," everything changed. Maya was barely a year old. He never saw it coming. Nick had a choice to make, and he made it without hesitation. He left the army, gave up the 6-figure salary and the accolades, and started over. A humble maintenance contractor job allowed him to pick Maya up from school every day, help with her science projects, and kiss her forehead goodnight. From briefing NATO generals to unclogging HVAC lines in corporate towers. From leading men in war zones to reporting to 20-something supervisors who couldn't change a light bulb without Googling it first. But when Maya, with her mother's auburn eyes and curious brain, hugged him tight and said, "You're the best daddy in the whole galaxy," Nick knew he'd made the right call. Every sacrifice made sense in that moment. Her laughter, her spark, her brilliance, it was all the purpose he needed. She was obsessed with how things worked, how broken things could be put back together. Once, with childlike sincerity, she said, "People break too. But sometimes they can still be fixed, right?" Nick had hugged her so hard it nearly knocked the wind out of him. His little girl understood more than most adults he knew. 3 weeks before the blackout, Nick had met Vivian Halston for the first time. Though met might be too generous a word. He had been called to the executive floor to deal with a partial power loss caused by a faulty circuit breaker. The team of engineers had spent 2 hours arguing over outdated schematics and building code violations. Nick showed up with his worn toolbox and 20 years of hard-earned experience. Within 10 minutes, he had the issue narrowed down to a corroded ground wire hidden behind imported Italian paneling. While the others debated, he quietly made the fix. Just as the lights flickered back on, the elevator doors opened with a sharp ding. Vivian stepped out, heels clicking against the marble, her phone to her ear as she negotiated a multi-million-dollar merger with her usual steely composure. She didn't notice Nick at first, not until she saw the streaks of dried mud across the floor. He had tracked it in from the lower-level parking lot after stepping through a puddle on his way to the service entrance. The muddy splash on the marble stood out like a scar. Her voice, sharp and clipped, cut through his concentration. "You there, maintenance." She didn't look at him directly, just pointed toward the parking lot. "There's mud on the driver's side of my Tesla. Clean it. And be careful with the paint." Nick placed his tools down slowly, deliberately. He stood up and turned to face her. Their eyes met. She expected defiance, or maybe indignation. But instead, she found something unexpected. A calm gravity. A quiet dignity that made her stomach twist for reasons she couldn't name. "I'll clean it," he said, with the faintest trace of something unplaceable in his voice, "with the cleanest hands I've got." She barely heard him. Her attention already returned to the voice on the other end of her call as she walked away. But later that night, when she reviewed the building's security footage while investigating an unrelated incident, she saw him, on camera, standing next to her car in the lot, meticulously wiping it clean, not with water and a rag, but with detailing tools from his personal kit. It took him 15 minutes. He buffed the smudge until it disappeared entirely. It wasn't about the car. It was about the way you do anything being the way you do everything. And that, for reasons Vivian didn't quite understand, stuck with her longer than it should have. Vivian Halston had also seen something else on the security feed that day. After detailing her car with surgeon-like care, Nick Ramsey sat down beside an old homeless veteran who had taken up a quiet corner near the parking garage entrance. They shared a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, and Nick listened for nearly 20 minutes as the man recounted half-forgotten stories about the jungles of Vietnam and the things he had lost there. Vivian told herself it meant nothing. People either served a purpose or they did not. Nick was a tool, a technician with a knack for fixing things. Nothing more. But something about the way he cared, when no one was watching, stuck with her like a splinter under polished skin. His soft-spoken compassion, his unflinching calm, the way he listened rather than spoke. She kept brushing it aside, but it refused to leave her mind. The morning of the product launch felt more like the start of a military campaign than a corporate event. The main presentation hall swelled with over 200 journalists from across the globe, flown in from 30 different countries. Precision was non-negotiable. The entire event revolved around a live demonstration of Halston Dynamics' newest achievement, a network of compact, synchronized solar panel arrays capable of powering an entire city block from an area no larger than a basketball court. The system was sleek, fast, modular, and if it worked flawlessly, it would lock in contracts worth upwards of $60 billion. The Department of Energy had sent a full delegation. 3 U.S. senators were seated in the front row. Everything rode on the performance of one massive generator, the central power core not only for the demonstration array but for the entire building's electrical grid. At exactly 11:30 a.m., as the final system check was underway, that generator gave out. No warning. No buffer. Just a sharp whine followed by dead silence as the lights cut and the screens blinked off. Panic rippled instantly. It made no sense. The generator was barely 2 years old, imported from Sweden, equipped with a triple redundancy system. The top engineering minds, 15 of them, many with PhDs from Stanford, MIT, and Caltech, crowded around their diagnostic tablets, growing more frantic with each inconclusive result. The lead engineer, a stiff, silver-haired man named Dr. Terrence Blaine, finally spoke. His voice was grim. Minimum 6 hours to isolate the problem. Add 3 more for repairs. Maybe 4. Vivian stood at the head of the glass conference table, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles turned pale. 9 hours. 9 hours would destroy everything. The journalists would leave. Investors would pull out. Politicians would remember this collapse when federal contracts were on the table. Her father would have called it proof that women crumbled under real pressure. Nick, meanwhile, had been fixing an HVAC issue in the lower levels when he was summoned to the main hall, more for show than actual contribution. Someone figured having technicians moving around at least looked productive. He stood quietly in the corner, tool belt on his hips, watching the elite engineers spiral into chaos. Were they panicked, he assessed. His eyes drifted to the large office windows overlooking the generator building. There, something caught his attention. A faint distortion in the exhaust vent. He narrowed his gaze. It was subtle, but he had seen it before. Not an electrical issue. A mechanical one. A specific kind of failure. He'd seen it under worse conditions, where sandstorms clogged systems faster than they could be cleared, where downtime meant lives lost. Slowly, he stepped forward, keeping his voice low but clear. "It's the safety valve," he said. The room quieted instantly. Half out of confusion, half out of disbelief. Dr. Blaine raised an eyebrow, then scoffed. "The safety valve? That's your expert opinion? You're a maintenance contractor, not an engineer." Nick shrugged. Same failure happened in Kandahar. Different model, same Swedish build. Faulty valve triggered cascading shutdown. Looks electrical on the surface, but it's not. "I can fix it." Laughter rolled across the room like thunder, especially from Preston Haynes, a fresh-faced MIT grad with more arrogance than fieldwork. "You're suggesting our entire engineering team missed something you, the janitor, managed to spot through a window?" Preston said, chuckling. "Come on. That's insane." Vivian's frustration burned just beneath her skin. She didn't have time for pissing contests. The wall clock read 12:45 p.m. 75 minutes to recover, or go down in flames. Her mind raced through the optics, the fallout, the board's response. One wrong decision and it would all come crashing down. But Nick didn't waver. His face was steady, his voice unshaken. No defensiveness. No bravado. Just certainty. Vivian studied him closely. Her father had taught her how to read people like spreadsheets, look for pressure points, for tells. Nick Ramsey was not lying. And he wasn't grandstanding. He genuinely believed he could fix it. "How long?" she asked, cutting through the engineer's objections. Nick looked her dead in the eyes. 90 minutes. Maybe less, if the parts haven't fused. Outrage erupted from the team. "That's absurd. He'll damage the unit. You'll tank the launch." Vivian raised one hand. Silence fell. She walked across the room with deliberate steps and stopped just inches in front of Nick. He could smell her perfume, cold, clean, expensive. Like winter roses and crystal. Her voice was low, but laced with dangerous charm. "Let me make this interesting," she said. "You're claiming you can do what none of my top-tier engineers can. If you're right, if the generator's up and running before too." She leaned closer, her tone flirtatious, but her eyes cold. "I'll kiss you. Right here. In front of all of them." A low murmur passed through the room. "But if you're wrong," she continued, "you're fired. On the spot. No severance. No references. No second chances." A stillness fell over everyone. The kind that precedes a crash. They expected him to laugh nervously. Back down. Apologize and walk away. Instead, Nick met her gaze with eyes the color of worn leather and fire-tested resolve. What he said next would stay with Vivian Halston for a long, long time. "I don't care about your kiss, Miss Halston," he said. "But my daughter's got a robotics showcase at her school tonight. And she's gonna need the lights to be on. I'll fix your generator. Because that's the right thing to do. That's the only reason I need." Without waiting for permission, he turned and walked toward the generator wing. The room parted like a tide in his path. Outside, Nick shed his outer work shirt, revealing a fitted white t-shirt beneath, sweat already dotting his shoulders. His movements were efficient, deliberate, like a man used to getting things done when wasted time could cost lives. Inside the generator casing, he found the damage to be worse than expected. But not impossible. Not for him. The pressure release valve had not simply malfunctioned. It had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction across the entire system. Diagnostic panels flashed error codes the engineers could not even interpret. But Nick Ramsey had seen worse, far worse. Once, during his final deployment, he had restored power to a mobile trauma hospital using salvaged parts from 3 different generators, all while under mortar fire. He began by bypassing the primary control system entirely, a move that would have horrified any of the engineers watching him through the building's security feeds. Armed with tools from the same battle-scarred kit he'd carried through multiple combat zones, he started splicing backup circuits and rewiring lines, constructing a manual override from scratch. His hands moved with muscle memory built over 20 years of real-world improvisation. Wire by wire, he created connections not found in any manual, connections forged in sweat, dust, and necessity. His white t-shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat as the generator chamber's temperature climbed steadily. The machine resisted him. Every built-in failsafe was now fighting his efforts to bring it back online. But those failsafes were written by engineers who had never had to choose between precision and survival when lives were on the line. They had never felt the weight of urgency press against their spine like gravity in a collapsing trench. Nick was no longer in a corporate basement. He was back in Kandahar, midsummer, baking under 40-degree heat, desperately trying to reroute power to a clinic overflowing with civilians, many of them children. Except this time, the life on the line was smaller. More personal. His daughter Maya had spent the last 3 months building her first robot. She called it Helper, because, in her serious 8-year-old words, robots are supposed to help people, Daddy, not hurt them. She had coded it from scratch, learning from borrowed books and secondhand guides that Nick had bought using money saved by skipping lunch for weeks. Her robotics showcase was tonight. She had made him promise, cross his heart and everything, that he would be there at 6, sitting in the front row so she could see him cheering when she proved to the world that a little girl from Queens, raised by her dad, was just as brilliant as any other kid out there. Meanwhile, the engineering team had assembled in the building's security office, watching the monitor feeds with a mix of disdain and morbid curiosity. Their earlier mockery was fading, replaced by confusion. Then quiet awe. One of them leaned closer to the screen, eyes narrowing. "He's rerouting power through the auxiliary capacitors," the engineer murmured. That's insane. Completely against protocol," another added, voice hushed. "But it might actually work." Preston Haynes, MIT's golden boy, hovered over his tablet, frantically scanning diagrams. "Those connections aren't random," he muttered. "He's building a generator within the generator. How the hell does a contractor know how to do that?" Dr. Blaine didn't respond. He simply stared, eyes fixed on the screen, watching Nick's oil-blackened hands move with a level of skill that could not be taught. Only earned. At exactly 3:03 p.m., Nick tightened the final connection. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence. The generator sat lifeless, a $12 million corpse. Then, deep within its core, something shifted. A low hum began, barely audible, like the first heartbeat of something long dormant. Nick placed his hand on the side of the housing, fingers resting flat against the warm metal. He adjusted the lines, feeling the rhythm through his palm, tuning his improvised circuitry with micro-movements. The hum grew. Stronger. Steadier. At 157 degrees internal temperature, the machine let out a deep, mechanical growl, not the polished purr of a healthy system, but the guttural roar of something being dragged back from the brink by sheer willpower. And just like that, the building came alive. Lights flared. Screens blinked to life. The demo network in the auditorium surged with power. In the main hall, the crowd of engineers stood in stunned silence. Then someone clapped. Softly, hesitantly. Then another joined. And another. Until the entire room thundered with applause, except Vivian Halston, who stood still as stone near the window, watching him. Nick emerged from the generator housing like a soldier returning from battle. His t-shirt was drenched in sweat and stained with grease. His arms, smudged with grime. His face, exhausted, focused, unbothered. He never looked up at the conference room window. Never sought praise. Never waited for approval. He just pulled out his phone, checked the time, and walked toward the service exit. Vivian watched him go, 1,000 thoughts churning beneath her ice-calm exterior. "Who is he?" she asked almost to herself. Her assistant flipped through a tablet. "Nicholas Ramsey. Contract maintenance. Hired 3 months ago." Before that, the assistant paused. Former major in Army Corps of Engineers. Multiple commendations. Bronze Star. Retired 4 years ago. Personal reasons. Vivian understood that phrase. In military files, personal reasons always meant family. She kept watching as Nick disappeared down the stairwell, likely heading to sign out for the day. Just an hour ago, she had barely registered him as a person. Just another name on a clipboard. Another replaceable part in the corporate machine. But now there was something she could not name, something dissonant, buzzing in her head. The product launch was flawless. Everything worked. The press ate it up. Investors smiled. The senators gave polite nods. But Vivian's focus kept drifting, to the service entrances, to the shadows, searching for someone who had already left. She found him in the parking garage, loading his gear into the back of a beat-up Ford pickup that looked older than some of her interns. He had changed into clean clothes, dark jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look like every working-class man her father had trained her to overlook. But his posture was steady, his movements precise. There was no swagger, no need for attention. Just quiet competence and earned dignity. "You left," she said, striding toward him, heels echoing like gunshots on the concrete floor. Her voice carried the same tone she used in boardrooms, the tone that shut down arguments. "The launch isn't over." He kept loading his tools into the back of the truck without looking at her. "My job was to fix the generator," Nick Ramsey said. "Shift ended at 2. His calm, dismissive tone hit her harder than she expected. Vivian Halston wasn't used to being the one left standing. People did not walk away from her. They waited to be dismissed. She flinched, just slightly, as the weight of his earlier words settled in again. The promise. The one she had mocked. The one he had kept. Then he looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was not desire, not even pride. It was a kind of tired amusement, like someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by its pettiness. "You mean the kiss?" he said with a small, weary smile. "That was never for me. That was for your engineers. To remind them that even their failures were worth more than my success." His accuracy stunned her into silence. Then, in the same steady voice, he added, "I've met people like you before, Miss Halston. People who think everyone around them exists just to reflect their own importance. But here's the thing you might not get. I don't need your approval. I don't need your kiss. I fixed your generator because it was broken, and I knew how to fix it. That's all." He turned toward his truck, ready to climb in. But something, pride, curiosity, or maybe a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, made her reach out and grab his arm. Her hand met real muscle beneath the soft flannel. Solid. Not sculpted in a luxury gym, but carved through years of honest work. Nothing in her corporate world had ever felt quite that real. "Wait," she said, hating the hesitation in her voice. "You were right. About the valve. About the solution. And yeah, about the reason I made that ridiculous offer. But you still surprised me. In my world, no one walks away from a chance to gain an advantage. No matter how absurd it is." Nick looked down at her hand, manicured and precise, resting against the weathered skin of someone who actually used his hands for a living. The contrast between them was sharp, almost poetic. "In my world," he replied quietly, "advantages aren't handed down by people like you. They're earned. Every day. By showing up, doing the job, and going home to the folks who really matter." Those words should have offended her. Should have sparked some sharp rebuttal. But instead, they struck a different chord. A pull. Like gravity had shifted. Before she even realized it, she rose up on the balls of her feet and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Not the showy, calculated kiss she had threatened. Not the performance she promised. But something smaller. Something honest. His skin was rough with stubble. Alive. He smelled like motor oil and effort. Real effort. Not cologne crafted in boardrooms by marketing teams. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words felt foreign in her own mouth. "For saving the ship." He stepped back just slightly, studying her like he was seeing her for the first time. "I didn't do it for you," he said. "Or your ship. I did it for Maya. My daughter. She needs to know that when something breaks, we fix it. We don't quit. We don't point fingers. We fix it." And with that, he got in the truck and drove off, leaving her standing in the fading light of the parking lot. Vivian Halston stood there a long time after the taillights disappeared, feeling something she had not felt since the day she found her mother's body. Dizzy. Not from sadness, but from the unsettling realization that the world might be much bigger, and messier, than the narrow corridor of power she had been raised to walk. 3 days passed before she saw him again. He was in the lobby, kneeling beside an elevator panel with a screwdriver in one hand and wires spilling out from the wall. She had just returned from a board meeting. Their eyes met in the reflection of the marble. She waited for something. Recognition? A nod? Interest? Instead, he gave her the kind of brief, professional nod one mechanic might give another before going back to the task at hand. It stung more than she expected. After that, she started noticing him, watching quietly. He always ate lunch alone, but he never looked lonely. Younger maintenance guys approached him often, asking questions. And he always taught, never just fixed the problem and walked away. He mentored, and he carried a photo of Maya in his wallet, faded from wear. The edges curling. He pulled it out often. Once, she overheard him on the phone with the school. He was explaining, calmly but firmly, that he could not make a midday parent meeting. Could they schedule something earlier, maybe before 7 a.m.? He just could not afford to miss work hours. A week after the generator incident, Vivian made a decision that even she could not fully explain. Halston Dynamics was hosting its annual charity gala, $500 a plate, black tie, the kind of event where money pretended to care about virtue. She instructed her assistant to hand-deliver an invitation to Nick Ramsey. The invitation came back the next day with a short, handwritten note. "Thank you for the offer. Unfortunately, I already have plans. Friday night is pizza and movie night with my daughter. I'm sure you understand." She did not understand. People schemed for those invitations. Built careers on those rooms. But to Nick Ramsey, pepperoni pizza with a little girl mattered more. That Friday, she drove through Queens. She did not even know why. But as she passed a corner pizzeria, she saw them. Through the fogged glass, there they were, Nick and Maya, sharing a pizza. The girl was animated, gesturing wildly as she made her point about something. Nick was listening like her words were gold. Then he laughed, an honest, full laugh, and in that moment, something lifted from him. The weariness. The burden. For just a second he looked young. Habit-free. The following Monday, during his lunch break, Vivian walked into the maintenance lounge. Nick sat alone at a scratched-up metal table, eating what looked like a homemade sandwich and flipping through a tattered manual. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. Every other technician in the room froze. The CO, wearing a tailored suit worth more than their monthly salaries, stood at their lunch table. Nick looked up. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. But no fear. "It's a free country," he said. Not an invitation, but not a refusal either. She sat down. Her handbag looked absurd next to the metal tabletop. "I wanted to apologize," she said. Words she had never spoken in a business context. Not once. About the kiss. It was out of line. "You deserve better." He stared at her for a long moment. Then nodded once. Apology accepted. The silence that followed was not awkward, exactly, but it was thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Vivian asked the one that had been gnawing at her since she received the note. "Why didn't you come to the gala? It could have been good for your career." Nick gave a small smile, but it never made it to his eyes. "Miss Halston, I already had a career. I had the titles. The awards. All of it. But none of it meant a damn thing the night my daughter woke up crying for a mother who wasn't coming back." He looked at her plainly. Now, all that matters is being Maya's dad. The honesty of it hit harder than any corporate speech she had ever heard. Brutal in its simplicity. It cracked something inside her, and out came words she had never shared with anyone outside of therapy sessions bound by confidentiality. She told him about finding her mother, about the note, about spending 18 years proving that love was weakness, and she would never let it own her. Nick just listened. No judgment, no pity, no attempt to turn it into a life lesson. Just quiet understanding. When she finished, he looked at her and said, "That must have been hell." Then, softly, "But you're wrong about one thing. Love's not weakness. Love is the only thing that makes us strong enough to get through hell." Those words shifted something between them. It wasn't quite friendship. Not romance, either. But it was recognition. A shared understanding of pain, and the different ways they had learned to survive it. After that, she started finding excuses to show up in the maintenance wings of the building. He stopped looking surprised when she did. They talked about Maya's school projects, about energy policy, about absolutely everything except the growing tension that hummed quietly between them like a live wire. Then came the storm. 3 weeks later, Arthur Halston made one of his rare appearances at headquarters. He said it was to review the quarterly numbers, but everyone knew he just wanted to remind the board who really owned the company. He caught sight of Vivian in the lobby, chatting with Nick about Maya's upcoming science fair entry. Their conversation was harmless, professional even, but he noticed something in his daughter's face that sent alarms ringing in his tightly wound brain. He waited until Nick walked off, then pulled Vivian into his office. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was low and dangerous. "That maintenance guy. I saw how you looked at him." Vivian fought down the instinctive childhood fear that used to freeze her under her father's glare. She answered coolly, "I do not know what you're implying. Nick Ramsey is a contractor. Nothing more." Arthur gave a dry, knowing laugh. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen that look before. Your mother wore that same look, right before the world reminded her exactly where she stood. That man is beneath you, Vivian. In every way. And whatever it is, before you embarrass yourself, and this company. And the worst part? He was right. Not about Nick, but about the look. She had been looking at him differently. Searching for him in the building. Thinking about him at night in her echoing penthouse. Wondering what it might be like to be loved by a man who would choose pizza night with his daughter over any billionaire gala. But daughters of Arthur Halston did not get to want things like that. "Nothing's going on," she said flatly, though her chest ached with the lie. "Nick Ramsey is maintenance. I'm the so. We live in different worlds. But the thing about different worlds, they collide." The next evening, Vivian stayed late, trying to lose herself in spreadsheets and forecasts. The building was nearly empty when she heard the sound of a child crying. She followed it, her heels echoing down the corridor, and found Maya curled up on a small couch in the maintenance lounge, tear-streaked and shivering. Nick knelt beside her, his face creased with worry. "Hey," Vivian said softly, not wanting to intrude, but unable to walk away. "What happened?" Nick looked up, his face drawn and tired. He looked older than she remembered. "She's sick. Fever spiked fast. I couldn't leave work. I used all my sick days already for her school events. I had no choice but to bring her here." Vivian crouched down beside him without hesitation and gently pressed the back of her hand to Maya's forehead. The little girl blinked up at her through fever-glazed green eyes, the same eyes that must have once belonged to a woman who walked away. "You're the pretty lady Dad talks about," Maya mumbled. Nick flushed. "Kids say the wildest things," he muttered. But Vivian felt something strange and unfamiliar twist in her chest. "I've got better air conditioning in my car," she said suddenly, helping Maya sit up. "Let's get her out of here." The drive to Queens felt like a dream. Vivian Halston, CEO of a global energy firm, driving through blue-collar neighborhoods in her Tesla. In the back seat, a sleepy, feverish child. Beside her, a contractor giving directions. Halfway there, Maya dozed off, murmuring something about robots and angels. Nick carried her up 3 flights to a modest apartment, and Vivian followed him through the door, and into a world she had never imagined. The apartment was small, but immaculate. The fridge was covered in Maya's colorful drawings. On the kitchen table sat a half-finished robot, neatly labeled in Nick's handwriting. This place had warmth. So, it was a home. Something her penthouse had never been. She stayed while Nick tucked Maya into bed, sitting quietly on a beat-up couch and looking around at the photos on the wall. Nick in uniform. Younger, stronger, unshakable. Nick and a beautiful woman, their wedding day, faces bright with a hope that hadn't yet been betrayed. Nick cradling baby Maya, his expression softened with a love so pure it hurt to look at. When he returned to the room, she braced herself for awkwardness. Instead, he made instant coffee. Not the hand-roasted, small-batch stuff she was used to. But it was oddly perfect. They sat and talked. For hours. About everything. And absolutely nothing. Until 3 in the morning. They talked late into the night. About dreams that never came true, love that slipped away, and the quiet burden of feeling responsible for someone else's happiness. As dawn painted the Queen's skyline in muted gray, Nick glanced out the small window and said quietly, "Your father's going to burn you alive if he finds out you were here." Vivian, too tired to lie, nodded. "He already warned me. Said you're beneath me. That people like us don't mix with people like you." Nick gave a weary half-smile, not bitter, just honest. "He's not wrong. You're champagne and boardrooms. I'm cheap beer and time and a half. Your world eats guys like me for breakfast, and mine would bore you to death in a week." But that was the thing. Nothing about Nick bored her. Not the way he spoke, not the way he looked at the world, and definitely not the way he loved his daughter. The science fair was the following Saturday. Vivian showed up in jeans and a sweater, clothes she had to go out and buy, awkwardly asking the store clerk, "What does a normal woman wear to a school gymnasium?" Nick barely registered the effort, though the small smile on his face when he saw her said more than words ever could. Ellie was practically vibrating with excitement, dragging her teacher behind her like a proud tour guide. Vivian stood still as the little girl confidently explained her robot project to the judges. "It can detect objects and move around them," she said, beaming. "Just like people should. When something's in your way, you don't quit. You find another way around." Her robot won second place. Ellie could not have been happier if it had won the Nobel Prize. Nick lifted her onto his shoulders, and for a split second, Vivian saw what a real family might look like, unguarded, unpolished, and full of genuine love. But the dream shattered that night. Arthur Sterling was waiting inside her apartment when she returned. He had let himself in, of course. He owned the building. The confrontation was brutal, not in volume but in surgical precision. "I know where you were," he said, tossing a stack of photos onto the table. "At a children's science fair. With him. With his child. Have you completely lost your mind?" She wanted to scream. To fight back. To tell him he had no right. But all she felt was exhaustion. The kind that sits deep in your bones after 34 years of trying to be someone else's version of perfect. "What exactly are you so afraid of?" she asked. "That I'll be happy? That I'll choose something different than this cold, hollow success you built for me?" "I'm afraid," Arthur said, brutally honest, "that you'll end up like your mother. Destroyed by the belief that someone beneath you can love you for who you are, not what you're worth. That maintenance man doesn't see Vivian. He sees a promotion. A path to stability. He sees food stamps and night shifts and charity handouts. And the worst part? He hit a nerve. Because deep down, she had wondered the same thing. How could Nick, a man she once treated like background noise, love a woman who once offered him a kiss like it was an insult? Who represented everything he had walked away from? "You're right," she said, the words bitter in her throat. "It was a mistake. It won't happen again." But promises made in penthouses rarely survive in the real world. She tried to stay away. She buried herself in work, in mergers and earnings calls, in the version of success that looked great in Forbes but felt empty at 3 in the morning. Still, the building wasn't that big. And hearts don't follow orders. Nick changed. She saw it in the way he carried himself, quieter, more tired, like something inside him had gone dim. The casual hallway chat stopped. The spark in his eyes faded. She overheard him gently steering Ellie away from asking if Miss Vivian could come to her birthday. It broke something in her. 2 months passed. She learned he was looking for a new job. Not just to move on, but to disappear from her orbit completely. And then came the rainy Thursday. She was heading out late after a 16-hour day when she saw them in the parking lot. Nick was carrying Ellie in his arms, her small hands clutching his neck, her face pale and sick. His truck would not start. She heard him curse under his breath as the engine whined and sputtered. He gently laid Ellie down in the passenger seat, popped the hood, and started working under the pouring rain. His shirt soaked, his fingers numb, he kept going, shielding his daughter's body from the cold with his own. Vivian watched from a distance for 5 whole minutes. This man had fixed her $12 million generator but could not afford to fix his own damn truck. And still he tried. Always tried. Then she made a choice, the kind you do not come back from. The kind that either wrecks you or saves you, depending on how brave you are. She stepped out, heels splashing in puddles, her designer coat instantly soaked. "Get in the car," she said. It was not quite an order, not quite a plea. Nick looked at her, rain streaking down his face. She saw the pride battling with need. Then Ellie coughed, a wet, ragged sound that settled it. They drove in silence. Vivian gripped the wheel. Nick cradled his daughter in the back, whispering reassurances. Ellie murmured something about oil-slick rainbows and robots and angels, her fever breaking somewhere along the way. At their building, Nick carried her up the 3 flights of stairs, and Vivian followed him inside. She did not wait for permission. She helped him change Ellie into dry pajamas, brewed honey tea for her throat, sat by her bedside and read a book about robot helpers while Nick called a clinic, asking to pay in installments. When Ellie finally fell asleep, the silence between them grew thick. Nick stood across from her in the tiny living room, arms folded. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why are you really here?" Vivian opened her mouth to say something safe, something professional. But what came out was real. Instead of dodging, she just told him the truth. "Because I'm tired of being my father's daughter. Because I'm exhausted from living under the shadow of my mother's death. Because when I see you with Ellie, I remember that love isn't weakness. It's the only kind of strength that matters. Because I'm falling for you, Nick, and it scares the hell out of me, and I just don't care anymore." Nick crossed the room in 2 firm strides and cupped her face in both hands, rough but tender. "Vivian," he said, her name soft on his tongue like both a prayer and a warning. "This is gonna wreck you. Your father. Your world. Everything you've built." She laughed, genuinely, and even surprised herself. "Maybe it should be wrecked. Maybe I need to tear it all down." And he kissed her. Not like the kiss she once dangled like an insult, but a real one, raw, urgent, and completely transforming. In the weeks that followed, they built something, not a typical relationship, that word was too small, but something real, something healing. A rebuilding of 2 people who had been broken in different ways, trying to piece their lives back together, edge by fractured edge. Vivian learned to live in his world of grocery budgets and school schedules. Nick cautiously explored hers, though he refused every attempt to ease his life with her money. They fought, mostly over pride and independence, over what it meant to accept help when you love someone. But they laughed more than either had in years. Ellie was the bridge between them. She welcomed Vivian into their little world with the ease only a child has, just happy to see her dad smiling again. The secret did not last. It all came crashing down during the company's annual Christmas gala. Arthur insisted that Vivian attend with Harrison Wells, son of a senator, rich enough to buy a few swing states, and ambitious enough to try. Vivian agreed, only to avoid suspicion. She planned to arrive, smile, and slip out. But Harrison was drunk and handsy, cornering her on the balcony with a whispered offer to skip the gala and head upstairs to his suite. That was when she spotted Nick, across the room, part of the maintenance crew, invisible to everyone, except her. Their eyes met. She saw him begin to move toward her. She stopped him with just one look, right before driving her knee into Harrison's groin, exactly as her self-defense instructor had taught her. Harrison collapsed. The room stirred. Whispers floated. And Arthur saw it all. He saw her glance at Nick. He saw the fury on Nick's face. And in that moment, he finally understood what his expensive private investigator had missed. The confrontation was fast, public, brutal. "You're done," Arthur growled at Nick, loud enough for the music to hush around them. "Clean out your locker. You're fired. And if you ever go near my daughter again, I'll bury you. You'll never work in the city, and your daughter won't get into a single school, not even community." Nick stood tall, refusing to flinch. But he did not look at Arthur. He looked at Vivian. And in his eyes, she saw understanding and surrender. He was not going to fight for her if it meant dragging her down with him. He turned and walked away, back straight, while the crowd whispered and gawked and fed off the spectacle. Vivian stood frozen, champagne flute in hand, watching her father smirk in victory. "Well," Arthur said coolly, "time to return to the real world. Harrison's still interested, if you're done with your little outburst." That was the moment she finally found her voice, and the courage that had belonged to her mother all along. "No," she said clearly, loudly. "I'm done being your daughter. I'm done living your life. I'm done pretending that love is weakness when it's the only thing that makes us human." She placed her glass on a tray, turned, and walked right past him, past the stunned faces, past her old world, which now burned behind her like the wreckage it truly was. She found Nick in the parking lot, loading the last of his tools into his worn-out truck. "Where are you going?" she asked. He looked at her, soaked from the cold night air. His face held everything: sadness, love, resignation. "Leaving," he said. "Someplace where Ellie won't have to pay the price for my mistakes. Someplace where you can go on without me and forget what you're giving up." "What if," Vivian said, taking his grease-stained hands in hers, "what if we rebuild it all, together? What if Ellie got a mother who chooses her over every boardroom? What if you got a partner who understands that fixing broken things is the most important work there is? What if we stopped letting other people's fear define our love?" He pulled her into his arms, his voice barely holding steady. "You'd give it all up? The company? The money? That world?" Vivian smiled, freer than she had felt since the day she found her mother's body. "I wouldn't be giving up anything that matters. I'd be choosing everything that does." The wedding was small. Ellie was the flower girl, naturally. A few of Nick's army buddies came. But the biggest surprise was Arthur Sterling himself, showing up at the courthouse, older, quieter. He stood silently through the vows. Then, afterward, he pulled Nick aside. "Take care of her," he said. "That's not a command from a CEO. That's a request from a father." "In my life," Nick replied. And Arthur simply nodded. He handed Vivian a white envelope before disappearing. Inside was a single wedding photo of her mother, radiant with hope on her own wedding day. On the back, written in her delicate hand, were words that would stay with Vivian forever. "Love is only weakness if you choose the wrong person to be strong for." 5 years later, Vivian stood in a different office, smaller, warmer, with crayon drawings and family photos taped to the walls. Carter Sterling Energy Solutions was a small firm now, focused on sustainable power for working-class communities. No Fortune 500 features. No Forbes covers. But the impact? It mattered more than anything she had ever built before. Nick handled the tech. His military and field experience were priceless. Vivian ran the business side, her connections opening doors that would have stayed closed otherwise. They were true partners, rebuilding the world one generator at a time. Ellie, now 12, had just won the state robotics championship. Her creation could find alternate routes around any obstacle and never gave up. Just like her dad had taught her. Just like Vivian had learned over pizza and late-night robot books. At the celebration dinner, Ellie raised a glass of root beer. "To Mom and Dad," she grinned. "Because sometimes, moms know enough." Vivian's eyes welled up. Because in that one line, she heard everything she had ever needed to know. Broken things are not thrown away. You fix them. Together. Nick reached for her hand under the table. His wedding ring caught the light. She squeezed back, feeling her mother's ring on her own finger, the one she found in that envelope 5 years ago. Later that night, after Ellie fell asleep, They stood on the balcony of their modest Queen's apartment. The view was not Manhattan. It was home. Do you ever regret it? Nick asked, wrapping his arms around her. The life you walked away from? Vivian looked up at him, at the man who gave her courage and love and a second chance. I did not walk away from a life, she said, kissing him slowly. I rebuilt one. With the best damn repairman in the business. He chuckled, that deep, warm sound that filled the cool night air. Someone once told me if I fixed their generator, they'd kiss me. And I meant it, she whispered. And in that tiny apartment, surrounded by old robot parts and new dreams, Vivian Carter finally understood what her mother had been trying to say in that heartbreaking note. Would you risk everything for true love? If this story touched you even for a moment, put a like to support such stories. Write in the comments, what would you choose, stability or feelings? Subscribe if you believe that even the most broken things can be fixed, if the right person is around. There are more stories to come that leave no one indifferent.